Welcome to the Glover Cottages in Sydney, where tonight we're introducing you to the 6 young people that make up our current intern program. They're all students of international affairs and have signed up to our program so as to get direct access to all our events and distinguished speakers, to be able to network with our members, many of whom have had live experience in senior jobs overseas, and to help in the running of the Institute. These guys are invaluable, and we try to help them with their subjects they're studying by putting them in touch with experts and also by giving them a focus that can't be had just from a textbook or a learned dissertation. Tonight, each of them is going to talk for a few minutes on a subject they've researched, so you, our members, can get an appreciation of their level of knowledge on subjects as varied as Hezbollah, stability in China, nuclear issues between India and Pakistan, and more. I'd like to pay tribute to the 2 counsellors running this programme, the director, Will Hobart, and Shannon Barnes, who will moderate this meeting. So please welcome Marion Kavanagh, Claire Deacon, Brendan Elliott, Eloise Johnson, Kate Noor, and David Simmons.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am indeed Brendan Elliott, and I'm indeed talking about India, Pakistan, and proliferation in South Asia. As Shannon said, basically, yes, I actually changed my topic last night about 10 o'clock. Originally I was going to, luckily I'm not handing the completed essay tonight, so that's okay. But originally I was intrigued by the impact of nuclear weapons on South Asia, on the relationship between India and Pakistan, because it's a very interesting situation. It's a really fantastic example for understanding the impact of nuclear weapons on our world, because with the other countries, when Britain developed theirs, when France developed theirs, China developed theirs weren't really weapons of huge necessity. It seemed more questions of national pride, of being able to get up there with the big boys and say, yes, we count in the world, we're important, you know, we're up there. And as far as the US and the USSR and the Cold War, when they developed their nuclear weapons, the whole conflict between the 2 superpowers was predicated on their possession of nuclear weapons. All strategic thinking, all relationships were based on the fact that they both had not only the bomb, but many thousands of bombs. So I mean, there's no real comparison of their relationship before the bomb, which was, you know, World War II, and before that they didn't really, you know, care about each other, and their relationship after the bomb, because it was all about the bomb. But India and Pakistan, their history, it's really quite, you know, as tragic a history as it is. As far as international relations scholarship goes, it's really quite neatly compartmentalised, at least in my opinion. You've got the first period from 1947 to 1974, partition until India's first test, where you had 3 large conventional wars, 2 over Kashmir, 1 over Bangladesh, and the secession of Bangladesh. And these were large, regular conventional wars with masses of troops. In 1965, the Second Kashmir War was the largest tank battle outside of World War II that the world had seen. And so you've got this first standard conventional war. It's well established that these are 2 countries that will fight, that do fight, that take this, you know, relatively minor provocations, or indeed I'm sure they believe that they weren't so minor, and they escalate the conflict both horizontally and vertically. They conduct multiple operations along their border. They invade each other's territory. It's, you know, it's a standard classic kind of warfare situation. End of the first period, India tests its nuclear bomb in 1974. It's the beautifully named Smiling Buddha, Pokhran 1 in May 18, 1974. It was 8 kiloton device tested, so I think it was maybe 16 times more powerful than the Hiroshima Nagasaki bombs. But not to worry, because India declared that it was a peaceful nuclear test, which is, I'm sure, assuaged all fears about the world. That luckily it's a peaceful nuclear bomb, not to worry. And so that ends the first era, and it becomes the era of India as a nuclear threshold state, where although they'd said publicly we don't want to become a nuclear bomb state, Indira Gandhi said, no, this isn't for us, we can do it, but we want to concentrate on civilian nuclear issues. Nonetheless, they kind of, like Israelis now, we don't we don't have the smoking gun or the mushroom cloud saying that they do have the bomb, that is 100% sure, but everyone assumes that either they do or they could very easily obtain one. It's no big issue, you may as well consider them as a nuclear power. More de facto than obvious that, you know, we have the bomb. And that changed the relationship very much so. In this period, India is kind of on the ascendant. They're a little more antagonistic. They launch small operations that don't really escalate. They attack a region of Kashmir, the Syrian Glacier in 1984. They take a little bit of Pakistani territory. Pakistan doesn't want to escalate this horizontally or vertically, neither does India. It's kept into small operational, you know, single operational level conflicts. It's, you know, they could fight all over their border. They've got the troops for it. They've done it before, but they don't. And during this time, Pakistan pushes to develop its own bomb. It buys the plan from China, and around 1984, India actually was strongly considering a number of attacks on Pakistan nuclear facilities. You know, much as we've seen recently with considering attacks on Iran and their nuclear facilities. That happened, you know, 18 years ago. History repeats itself. 28 years ago, sorry. But so we've got this second period, and India's on the ascendancy. They do Operation Brass Tacks, which is the largest military exercise since World War II. Again, 400,000 Indian troops massing on the Pakistani border. Again, this was a peaceful operation because they try and make things perfectly clear that they are for peaceful purposes. And so Pakistan responds peaceably by sending 300,000 troops to their border to stare at each other over the border and make menacing faces. Luckily, that does not escalate because this is because of the nuclear threat. They don't escalate things. And then 1998, India conducts its nuclear tests. Pakistan follows with its own, and a new era where India is less antagonistic, and Pakistan either they directly conduct infiltration, insurgent-style operations, as in the war over Kargil in Kashmir in 1999, or they allow terrorist groups to operate and exist within Pakistan, which strikes against India. Pakistan doesn't fear Indian retribution. India does not try retribution because of the nuclear shadow. And I was looking at all of this, and I wanted originally to study how the relationship changed because of nuclear weapons. Then I had this idea. I was just thinking, why did it take India 24 years, 1974 nuclear tests until 1998, to come out openly and say, we are a nuclear bomb power? In 1974, they conducted the test. People pretty much assumed they were a nuclear power. That was the idea, and so they didn't have to do anything about it. Everyone, Pakistan calmed down, less operations against India. That was fine. It seemed to work quite well. But then in 1998, all of a sudden, India decides, no, we need a proper nuclear test this time. We will detonate 5 warheads of various sizes. We will show the world and make it 100% clear we are a nuclear power. And nothing huge happened just before 1998. There was no new war. There was no massive escalation. India was not more under threat than it had been. China didn't do anything really to suggest that India needed a nuclear deterrent. Pakistan didn't do anything, but they decided all of a sudden we need it. And then, so I wanted to look at that, and I wanted to look at how, and at Pakistan, they were developing nuclear material in 1984. By 1987, US intelligence suggested that Pakistan had the material for a bomb in 87. They could do it if they wanted. They waited. 1996, later on, not during 1996, but Benazir Bhutto suggested that in 1996 they were ready, they were prepared to do nuclear tests if they wanted to, if India started. They waited until 15 days after India's tests in May 1998. With my paper, I want to explore why the wait. We've got a lot of theories on nuclear proliferation, what makes a country want to build a bomb, to have the bomb. Are they questions of nuclear deterrence, existential deterrence against an existential threat, or a real military threat, as India and Pakistan certainly faced? Are they questions of national pride? Are they domestic issues? Were India and Pakistan worried about controlling their domestic population and kind of saying, well, saying, look, everyone, be proud in our country. We have the bomb. We are the big deal. There's one theory as well which I want to test, which is the role of a leader, whether it's in a democracy, an autocracy, or something in between. There is a theory out there that suggests that you need a leader with a certain particular blend of characteristics, maybe a little megalomania, a slightly introverted kind of nationalistic kind of principles, but at the same time someone who wants to make a splash on the world stage. I know that sounds like any politician, any prime minister or president, but the correct, proper blend only comes around every so often. But in India and Pakistan's case, they had that blend often. They had a lot of leaders who wanted to, and I just want to explore why they didn't for so long, and then why they did. 24 years is a very long time. I'm not 24 years old. If I could build a nuclear bomb and wanted to at any point, 24 years is a long time. I'd want it by now. I'm a fairly impatient guy. So this is what I really want to explore with my paper. I want to, look at, I think 1974 when India tested their first bomb. Fair idea, fair call. They were worried about China, they were worried about Pakistan, they wanted to establish we can be nuclear power. That makes sense against traditional deterrence theory. You've got the right leader in Indira Gandhi, things work out fine. But then why do they wait? They had the capacity, they had the capability, but for various reasons, domestic, international, in terms of their leadership, they didn't for so long, and they decided they did. And that's really what I want to explore, that's what I want to look at, and I want to look at why Pakistan didn't for that same time. They felt more under threat, they had lost so many wars and battles to India that a nuclear bomb early on might have, re-energised the populace and really established the Pakistani government as legitimate in their eyes and said, look what we can do. So that's what I want to explore, that's what my paper's about. Thank you very much.
Hey, how's it going? I'm David. I'm one of the AIIA interns for this semester. As we've been charged with producing a research paper, we were encouraged to select a topic that we were genuinely interested in. With this in mind, the topic I've chosen to pursue relates to China's economic rise, specifically since the inception of Deng Xiaoping's open door policy in 1978. I intend to focus on and evaluate the most prominent issues that have arisen as a direct result of China's recent economic paradigm shift. Before doing so, I must preface that China's rise has generated numerous substantial benefits to the population. One of the most often cited examples pertaining to the extraordinary progress they've made in regards to poverty alleviation.
The microphone doesn't seem to be working.
Oh. Is that better? Try again. Hello? Okay. So yes, the China's rise has generated substantial benefits to the society. One of the most often cited examples relating to poverty alleviation, in which roughly 500 million people were extracted from below the poverty level to low to middle per capita income. And this was done within roughly a period of only 40 years. Whilst the anomalous level of China's annual GDP growth has brought these positive changes about, I have found that there are a number of negative effects that have also been felt, but far less focused upon. To break it down into this time period, I've outlined two primary issues and two primary effects of those issues from my research. These phenomena permeate numerous smaller problems.
Sorry, can you read a little bit more slowly?
Okay, no problem. Sorry.
I'm having trouble following.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. So yes, I've broken it down into identifying two primary issues that I've found underlie a majority of the problems, and two effects of those issues. These phenomena permeate a number of problems that face the Chinese Communist Party and raise legitimate concerns regarding how they'll be addressed in the future. The two primary concerns are, initially, the conflicting relationship that has emerged between post-1978 economic reforms and pre-existing Maoist state policy. The open door reforms were devised with an anticipated short-term effect and long-term outcome. Therefore, an initial spike in inequality as a result of the establishment of special economic zones was an expected short-term side effect. Deng Xiaoping himself stated, reflecting this opinion, that you must make some people rich first so as to leave all people to wealth. Thus, this initial inequality was tolerable because in the long term it would diminish. And then provided that the Chinese had adequate access to education and uninhibited migration to high-growth areas. However, in a number of cases, these projected outcomes have been hindered and obstructed by residual state policy that is still remained. An example demonstrating this is the Newport housing system. Essentially, this system is a residual housing registration system that separated the population into either urban or rural categories. Before 1978, migration between these two zones was strictly prohibited. After 1978, this was removed in theory. However, there remains a major institutional bias towards people that are rural applicants attempting to move into these high-growth urban areas. An example of this has been a selection process that prioritises skilled workers and the procurement of a job offer before travel is permitted. The second major concern I identified was the decentralised structure of China's governance system, particularly in regards to its fiscal policy. Essentially what's been created has been geographical poverty traps that have substantially increased the per capita income inequality within the state. A statistic pertaining to this states that from between 1990 to 2003, the ratio of per capita GDP from richest to poorest province grew from 7.3 to 13. The richest provinces in China hold more than 8 times the per capita public spending than the poorest province. These traps diminish the capacity for social mobility for inhabitants and have a huge determinant influence upon an individual's life expectancy, susceptibility to preventable illnesses, and their education level. The final point that I relate to it is that these two problems that I've identified interact with one another. The presence of these poverty traps as a result of the decentralised system has created a significant education and skill disparity between populations from the less affluent provinces and those from the urban centres. An example of this was data from 2003 that indicated that within the richer provinces, school enrolment was close to 100%, whilst within the rural regions at only 40%. Therefore, this has the additional impact of reducing the median level of education and further inhibiting the equalising factors that Deng Xiaoping believed would reduce that initial inequality over time. The two primary effects of these highlighted concerns I found were: one, a clear and rapid increase in per capita income equality within the Chinese populace, directly as a result of Deng Xiaoping's 1978 open door policy, and an increasing prevalence of population groups that have become more and more economically marginalised from the wealth that China's rise has generated. The final facet of my paper that I want to outline relates to the legal infrastructure and the legal system of China, particularly in regards to both the property rights afforded to citizens and the court system. In regards to the property system, China categorises its residents as either rural or urban and allocates them distinct rights in accordance with that status. Urban residents possess the typical rights of a property owner. They're able to buy, sell, use their property as an asset, and use it as collateral. However, rural residents don't have this same luxury. Technically, they do not own their houses, they're provided what is termed long-term tenure over it. And what most importantly, they are unable to use that property as a line of credit to bootstrap themselves from poverty. Furthermore, the state always reserves the right to co-opt any rural property they see and redistrict it as urban, offering a below-market remuneration package that reduces the social mobility of rural residents. 62% of displaced residents were worse off after property conversion, and data from 2002 to 2004 reveals that forced evictions and urban conversion seizures constitute 1/4 of all incidences of social unrest. So this displays how the legal system enhances inequality and marginalises vulnerable sections of society. Now the final aspect I want to relate to this regards the Chinese judicial system. That's a particularly interesting one to me, because it speaks about how the incapacity of the legal system to adequately and impartially redress people's issues indirectly encourages social dissent to continue. Essentially, the absence of any institutional means to address public grievances isolates the discontented and leaves civil disobedience as the only remaining option. Figures support this position, showing that between 2003 and 2005, public water disturbances grew by 50%, from 58,000 to 87,000. Furthermore, the government response to incidences of social dissidence and protest has been contradictory, applying simultaneously both aggressive repression in certain cases and mild concession, particularly if the protests endure over a longer period of time. Thus, there's been a realization that persistent acts of protest constitute the most likely means of receiving any kind of concession regarding social grievances. and reinforces the efficacy of public dissent and questions the government's capacity to address the public's needs. So as it stands, my paper essentially aims to demonstrate how the conflicting relationship between old and new state policy in the context of China's decentralized government has produced a number of major concerns regarding specifically, and most in particular, an uninhibited rise in per capita income inequality and the enduring prevalence of economically marginalized groups. As my research continues, I'm endeavoring to make a connection between this aforementioned phenomenon and the viability for social unrest in the future. I welcome any criticism or feedback because it will help me produce a better paper. Thanks.
We've got about a minute until I invite the next intern along, so is there anyone from the audience have a question for David? Jocelyn.
Thank you, Dave. I understand that the Australian government is about to phase out our aid program for China on the grounds that China is now affluent enough to be able to fix their own poverty and other social issues. Do you think this is a right decision, based on what you've said, you highlighted about social and economic inequality?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. I think, at least to me, it relates to what the definition of humanitarian and human rights is. For example, in China there can be applied a more utilitarian method in the sense that while some people will invariably suffer, as Deng Xiaoping stated, with some people becoming rich before others, over time those people will be later brought into the fold. From a more conventional Western perspective, it can seem to perhaps quite callous in the sense that there are dislocated regions, especially in rural area, outlying areas, where people are definitely suffering and existing right now below the poverty line. However, provided China believes they still have a solid agenda that they're working toward and making consistent progress with, I believe that they will continue to improve in regards to inequality, reducing inequality over time. So I'm not really sure which position I stand on, really regarding that, but I think it relates to how you define human rights and how you address it.
Hi everyone, so I'm Eloise, and thank you so much for coming this evening and listening to all of us. So as Hashem said, I'm talking about the scope of cooperation between Australia and Indonesia with regards to people smuggling. I will never forget the look the two men gave me as I walked out of the room for the last time. I know they were looking at me because I was looking at them. We'd spent quite a lot of time together, and I'd gotten to know them pretty well. Their names, ages, jobs, families, their lives, and why they were there that day, why I was there that day. But they didn't know who I was. They didn't even know my name, and they never would. But they knew that I was the person who stood up at the end of 3 weeks in a courtroom with the Crown and the defending lawyer, attempting to sway our consciences whether these men were threats to our national security or whether they were victims within a much larger context. Not guilty, I said, as the foreperson for the jury, and then we were all free to go home. I wanted to include this story to introduce one issue within a growing area of tension between the Australian and Indonesian governments, namely the people smugglers. Today I will be introducing to you my research paper, which will be a critical evaluation on the progress and limitations of Australia's cooperation with Indonesia with regards to people smuggling in the Asia-Pacific region. To begin with, one cannot discuss the cooperation between Australia and Indonesia on people smuggling without a discussion of the Bali process. The Bali process is a regional forum which focuses on fostering mutual goodwill and harmony in action on people smuggling in the region. Since its inception in 2002, 3 other conferences have been held in 2003, 2009 and 2011. It has 43 member states and is one of the largest regional consultative processes in the world. In March 2009, the Australian and Indonesian governments agreed that their spirit of cooperation had had a significant impact on the number of people smuggled. However, the sharp number of people smuggled, the increase since then have proved these statements to be rather premature. The Bali process has been criticised for its lack of information sharing, its power imbalance by wealthier Western states, and its lack of concrete action. Due to its nature as a soft diplomacy, it is rather a trust-building exercise rather than a tangible dispute settlement mechanism or forum for treaty development. Additionally, the irregularity of its meetings and the lack of a secretariat and a regular body throughout its operation have produced a disjointed agenda. Yet one cannot ignore that this forum involving states of such cultural, social, economic and legal diversity demonstrates a significant feat in cross-cultural collaboration. However, the Bali process is only the first stage in developing a deeper analysis and approach towards people smuggling and movement which will continue to be a constant feature in Australia's and Indonesia's relationship. People seeking freedom from harm and want is not a problem and not one that can be solved. People smugglers search for a better life from their own poverty through facilitating the alleviation of poverty of another's. This appears in reality to be a poverty cycle, far from the Australian government's stated mission to smash the people smugglers' business model. The idea of people smugglers as a part of a larger enterprise could not be further from reality. Therefore, how this idea influences public opinion within Australia and Indonesia, and how public opinion in turn influences government policy must be addressed. As Mackie argues, it is crucial to acknowledge the differences in ideas about national identity, unity and cohesiveness. Within the Australian conscience, there is a strong presence of queue jumping, and an inherent fear within this large slab of Europe in the south of being overrun by its extremely large northern neighbour. One only needs to scroll down into the online comments of any people smuggling related article from an Australian media source, and one will commonly view such responses as, "Why are you allowing a foreign country to dictate our policies, Labour? I thought we were in charge of our own destiny here, not Indonesia. And I can't see what the issue is. If my neighbour was to throw rubbish over the fence, then I just throw the rubbish back with a severe warning, problem solved." In comparison, Indonesian media appears to communicate the notion that Indonesia is being treated unfairly by its more prosperous southern nation. An emphasis is placed on the fact that asylum seekers are headed towards the destination, being Australia, and are merely bypassing Indonesia. A journalist in The Australian recently observed that there is a widespread view in Jakarta that people smuggling is essentially an Australian problem, albeit one that poses a significant impost on Indonesia, and one that should be dealt with by Australia. Ironically, Wesley argues that the reciprocal prejudice between both nations is so great that when Canberra and Jakarta's policies on people smuggling are actually in harmony, prospective publics become suspicious that their government is sacrificing national interest for cordial international relations. The harmful effects that criminalising people smuggling have on public perception on refugees in both nations cannot be discredited. Stereotypes and ill-informed views on people smugglers, therefore, constrain the Australian and Indonesian government's ability to effectively remove obstacles in the development of comprehensive policy. Australia has taken the leading role within its multilateral collaboration towards people smuggling within the Asia-Pacific, assuming the role as Deputy Sheriff. It has been the principal driver of the Bali process and frequently recommends policies that it considers beneficial for Indonesia to adopt. However, Australia's dominance in the Bali process has been met with some reservation, and Australia has not always been able to use its position as a relatively more powerful and prosperous state to dictate Indonesia's actions. Critics of the Bali process have commented that it has been propelled primarily by Western industrialised countries, which have sought to serve their interests rather than reflect a migrant-centred perspective. Additionally, the Bali process does not require any compulsory financial contribution in a bid to include smaller island states. In June 2009, theoretically, each member state possesses an equal authority. Yet, in fact, Australia commands a much greater influence within the Bali process, one of the reasons being that it is the forum's principal financial sponsor. Additionally, the Australian Federal Police actively supported the establishment of an anti-people smuggling unit within the Indonesian National Police, in which the AFP could provide recommendations on stricter policies in dealing with people smugglers. However, the Indonesian police rejected Australia's pressure to include people smuggling crimes under its human trafficking laws, challenging that they were different offences. Whilst Australia is the largest donor of foreign aid to Indonesia, which certainly sets power dynamics between the states, Australia must take into account Indonesia's values and views on people smuggling. Australia should acknowledge that Indonesia will not respond well to interference into its domestic political and social issues, which might be viewed as a neo-colonialist control of its sovereignty. Limits attend Australia's imposition of its views upon Indonesia and other states within the Asia-Pacific region, despite relative power and influence between the states. Lastly, I would like to suggest that the approaches taken by both governments of a narrow legal and security focus are not as sustainable management techniques, but simple barrier-building mechanisms. In June 2009, 30 prosecutions involving people smuggling had been recorded. 1 year later, 201 prosecutions were in progress, and by 2011 the figure had reached 304. As this number has risen, so has a growing consensus within the Australian legal profession that Australia's mandatory sentencing for deterring deprived, ignorant fishermen from Indonesia is futile. Attention has been drawn to the fact that the usual function of a court to assess the seriousness of a crime and issue proportionate sentencing has been removed. Until recently, people smugglers who breached Indonesian immigration and maritime law were shown leniency, with relatively soft punishments being issued. The Australian government had repeatedly drawn attention to Indonesia's lack of specific people smuggling laws as a significant flaw within its management of migration and people smuggling. It was only in May 2011 that Indonesia passed laws criminalising people smuggling with the enthusiastic support of the Australian government. Additionally, severe punishments were established for corrupt authorities who provided documents for a fee or refrained from reporting incidents of smuggling. The laws have taken 8 years to enact since they were first considered. However, as the trialling and mandatory sentencing of poor fishermen in lengthy and incredibly costly legal processes has had no impact on preventing smuggling, it is essential to assess the effectiveness of employing trialling and mandatory sentencing as a deterrent. As John Menadue, who, as Johnny mentioned, has been a past speaker here at the Institute, said, there is no solution or fix. People flows are often messy, unpredictable, and chaotic. Approximately 4 out of about 400 Indonesians detained on people smuggling charges in recent years have been organisers, with the remainder being impoverished fishermen drafted as crew members from isolated villages. And finally, within the plethora of migration research, it has been frequently acknowledged that Australian policy and the policy it supports in Indonesia is often dictated by the assumption that people movement can be turned on and off like a tap. A greater focus on the root causes of smuggling and migrant flows are needed to replace the temporary barriers that are being erected as a quick fix. Dr. Khalid Koza of the Lowy Institute has noted that there is in fact very little known about people smugglers and the people smuggling trade around the world. The current system is in serious need of a rethink, and a rethink again after that. Thank you.
Just before I start, I think I should let you all know as well, I just signed for the tie, and it smells really good, so there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I am a halfway mark, so hang in there. Yes, so Sherman's just introduced me. My name is Kate. I'm doing my honours year at NSW, and my research topic focuses on the evolution of Hizballah in regional politics, as a regional force. Specifically, it's looking at how Hizballah's militant actions act to complement rather than contradict its political participation in the Lebanese government, and how a balance between the two different modes of conduct can not only be maintained but very, very successful based on or determined by other regional influences. I think it's really important to address straight up the single most significant issue I have found in my research so far, not least because it's so fundamental, and it's this idea or this notion of researchers being ontologically shackled when they approach Hizballah. So by that, what I mean is that it's necessary to define the organisation in order to place it in its context, and yet there doesn't seem to be a sufficient category of definition to encompass Hizballah as either an identity or as an organisation. from what I've been exposed to so far, the ontological framework available out there for studies of Hizballah are limited to terrorism studies or civil society studies, neither of which I believe have the capacity to allow for a true understanding of Hizballah as both a political and a social force in Middle Eastern politics. I feel like the single-dimension labels, such as terrorist or civil society actor, make it very difficult to grasp the organisation's complexities, and if anything, it leads to an inferior quality of knowledge about the organisation being produced. These labels obviously have a lot of political advantage depending on who's wielding them, but in terms of knowing and understanding and predicting Hizballah's intentions and actions, they tend to be fairly useless. So, what I'm hoping to attempt with my study is, with my research, is to at least acknowledge, if not in some way mitigate, the obstacles, the ontological obstacles of this kind of framework. To do this, what I've chosen to do is look at the real organisational structures of Hizballah and their operational choices as a means of understanding the role that they play. My thesis as it stands is that Hizballah can successfully oscillate between militancy and political pragmatism in pursuit of its goals and its objectives because of the strength of its structures. Related to the structure of the organisation has been the development of an ideological framework that is flexible enough to allow for the specific circumstances of each situation without ever appearing to contradict standard broader ideology. The result has been incredibly successful by any measure of political model, let alone in comparison to other actors in the Lebanese context. So this flexible approach and this ability to employ different means to achieve their goals is central to any understanding of Hizballah, and more importantly, central to any prediction of their future action. There is this notion of establishing an Islamic order by hand or by mouth, which is to say by persuasion or by force, as dictated by the circumstances at hand. Historically, we've seen that the more favourable the circumstances, the more likely Hizballah is to resort to militancy and armed jihad to achieve its goals, for example, throughout the period of the 1980s and the 1990s. On the other side, the less favourable the circumstances, the more likely the party to resort to grudgeless pragmatist politics and unarmed means to continue with their objectives. And I think that we're experiencing one of these periods presently and have been doing so since the 2006 war. With a lot of evidence that Hizballah has become more engaged with the legal mechanisms of the state. If circumstances were to improve significantly for Hizballah, I think it's fair to predict that militant activity would also increase, and that's obviously very important to anyone studying international relations and international affairs in the region. So essentially my research will critique the division of power amongst different organs of the organisation, and we'll look at how the structure allows for very flexible, context-specific decisions to be made by different ranking officials to best suit the circumstances, be they militant or political. It will cover both the militant and social network apparatuses and look briefly at the clerical leadership, body as the single most important factor in balancing the very demanding standards of the ideological abstract with the reality at hand. So in terms of Hizballah's regional importance, there's another really important and obviously very topical dimension that I hope to address in my research, and that of course is the Hizballah-Syrian relationship. This relationship tends to be overshadowed by an emphasis in both academic and policy works by the significance of the Iran-Hizballah relationship, but I think that the Hizballah-Syrian relation can be far more fruitful and far more revealing of real dynamics in the region than just about any other line of analysis, and for that reason I think it should be explored further. So historically, Syria and Hezbollah have always had a fairly volatile relationship, and one that has always complicated Syrian-Iranian relations. I think that the issue of, for example, the disputed region of the Shivar farm region demonstrates this point really well. On the one hand, Syria has always and continues to support Hizballah and other fundamentalist groups. in their attempt to oust Western and Israeli influences in Lebanon. But on the other hand, it's not ready to just stand aside and allow Hizbollah's power and influence, as directed by Iran, to grow exponentially in Lebanon. I think Syria sees a critical mass point of power for Hizbollah, and beyond that role, it transforms itself from being a troublesome but still valid ally to an unknown and uncontrollable threat to Syrian interests in the region. There is again a religious dimension to the threat, with the Shia flavour of Hizbollah rule standing in conflict with both the Sunni majority of Syria and the Alawi elite rule of Syria. But I think when it comes down to it, it's fundamentally a question of real politics as opposed to religious tensions. It is interesting to note too that in times of direct negotiations between Syria and Israel, Hizbollah and Syrian-Hizbollah relations are often used as almost like a litmus test of intentions. So direct support of Hizbollah is scaled back by Syria as a sign of goodwill when entering into the negotiation, but it inevitably recommences again once the negotiations fail. In terms of Syrian influence on operational decisions for Hizbollah, the death of the older President Assad, Hafiz, in 2002 had a monumental effect on all Lebanese politics. Hafiz's rule was such that he exercised a degree of influence in just about every political faction in Lebanon, and his death meant that an obstacle for Hizbollah was removed in terms of its operational choices and its freedom to act. The current Assad, the Bashar, has never been nearly as successful in developing the clout or the influence that his father did to enforce his will or his wishes over Hizbollah, and nor has he been able to significantly block Iranian moves in the Lebanese arena. This failure or absence of influence has been as significant in developments in Hizbollah as the actual presence of Iranian interests in their successes with the organisation. It's very much understandable as following the death of the older Assad, the younger Assad inherited a system that was fragmented and essentially deadlocked, and he has since spent his time and energy looking at keeping his own house, and we're seeing even today the bloody results of this. Significantly for Hizbollah and the study of Hizbollah, Iran expanded into a vacuum left by a weakened Syrian interest, and it has been Iran that has decided that Hizbollah should allow to continue with this policy of political pragmatism with great success. So that's where I stand at the moment with my research. It's a bit much, I know, and the more I do, the more I feel like I was down the rabbit hole, but it's very interesting. So.
My name is Mary. I'm doing only my final year of law this year, so I'm sort of going to look at a more legal or international law aspect of sort of the global governance movement that's emerging, and something that's very topical at the moment is the responsibility to protect. So I'll just start by explaining sort of a few theoretical things, because it's sort of hard to follow unless you sort of understand those things. So it comes from an older idea of sovereignty as a responsibility. So there's this idea that every country has sovereignty and they can do whatever they want within those territorial population bounds, which is a whole separate issue which we could go into. But it's the idea that that there's a contract between the citizen and the state, and if the state breaks that contract, then they lose their sovereignty, sort of thing. And this sort of rose again, particularly in the 1990s after sort of the crimes, the mass genocide crimes that happened in Rwanda, and there was a complete failure of the international community, or not a timely intervention, which sort of, and also the intervention in Kosovo, which sort of raised a few eyebrows about whether that was a legitimate intervention and legitimate upset of sovereignty. So this idea of trying to sort of say, well, when is it and when isn't it okay to impinge on state sovereignty? And Kofi Annan was a great supporter of trying to reconcile these two principles of, which is basically what we're looking at, which is looking at sovereignty on the one hand, and then on the other hand of human rights. And so this idea of the responsibility to protect has emerged, and I'll get back to the legal foundations in a moment, but just to sort of outline what it is exactly. It's a responsibility, the first pillar is the responsibility of a state to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and from their incitement. And pillar two is the international community's duty to assist that state in fulfilling this responsibility. And pillar three, in the event that that state cannot fulfill that responsibility or sort of actively incites genocide, war crimes or ethnic cleansing, that the international community will intervene and use forceful means if that's consistent with the UN Charter, if that is necessary. So, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Am I on the right one?
Yes. So, the legal. So, is it okay? Is it legal for the international community to intervene? And the answer is, well, yes. According to the UN Charter, first of all, the use of force, according to the UN Charter, is one of the prohibition of the use of force is one of the main governing principles of the UN, because the UN basically, originally the League of Nations, emerged to stop the use of force, and that emerged after the horrendous wars that happened in the 20th century. And so the idea was to create an institution that would centralise the use of force where it was deemed necessary, not just have random countries in a decentralised use of force intervening where they feel they want to. So there are certain, based on this premise, there are certain exceptions where centralised intervention is justifiable. The first one is self-defence. George Bush sort of brought back anticipative self-defence, but humanitarian intervention is another one of those things. And it's a deeply rooted principle in customary international law. But the real crux of this argument is that it's a centralised use of force. So it's the Security Council saying, okay, we as an international community do not deem this to be okay in Rwanda, wherever, Syria, Libya, and we're going to utilise our force collaboratively and stop that humanitarian breaches. And the UN Charter specifically does not recognise humanitarian intervention. So, sorry, this is soft law, customary international law, and soft law. But the UN Charter, as a written document, particularly does not recognise humanitarian intervention for two reasons. The first reason is it's a fear of it being abused by powerful nations, because they're going to say, oh well, it's legitimised. If we see it as a humanitarian issue, then we can intervene. And then the second one is that it doesn't really need to, because the UN has, if it's a centralised intervention, then the UN has a wide-ranging powers to achieve its objectives, and one of those is the promotion and protection of human rights. So it doesn't need to specifically say that we can intervene. Yes. Sorry, I had a few issues with the slides, but yes, that's what I was saying as the second one. Yes, the next one. So this is Australia's contribution to R2P, responsibility to protect. Basically, Gareth Evans has been a massive player in. That's a very great photo. I thought that was quite funny. So, I mean, Gareth Evans jointly chaired the committee which Kofi Annan sort of set up to try and reconcile these two principles. And the ICISS, basically they did a lot of research into responsibility to protect, and they found that yes, it is obviously it's progress to protecting human life, but there needs to be some criteria which has become very, very topical with this Libya and Syria, which I'll get to. But there needs to be some criteria and guidelines when making decisions to intervene, and how the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, use their veto, also become very topical in Syria. And they were saying this many years ago, and these suggestions weren't adopted. But the three pillars that I discussed earlier were adopted, but they weren't adopted with these sort of criteria and guidelines, and that's become a real problem. So basically, Australia's contribution has been bilateral and it's been enduring. Bipartisan, sorry. So it's been sort of very rarely do both sides of politics come together on one issue, but they have over the Labor and the Liberal governments. So yeah, sounds good, and I think in general it's good to think of this as progression in having an international community that is progressing on human rights and protecting human rights. However, there's some really essential issues that have arisen, that have always been there, but have arisen particularly in the last sort of year or two after the Libyan intervention. And when Libya sort of went into civil war and there was sort of great loss of life occurring, the Security Council got together, and I think it was within 1 week. It was very decisive action. They went in within a couple of months, and then by October 2011, I think it was, they had withdrawn. The rebel forces had taken over the government and they had withdrawn. However, in Syria, and I'll get back to the problems with what has happened subsequently in Libya, but in Syria, when a similar situation arose, and I think the current death toll is about 9,000, and I mean, it was a very similar situation to what happened in Syria as well. We had Russia and China vetoing any sort of intervention, and this is still playing out, of course. But it's the structural issue with the Security Council, because we had Russia and China vetoing any resolution to sort of intervene in Syria. And you have to sort of ask yourself, how can this humanitarian intervention be contingent on the capricious whims of countries when it's a political matter? Shouldn't it's a humanitarian intervention? How can human life be contingent on whether it's strategically advantageous for China? So I think there's a structural issue with the permanent 5 and the use of the veto. And that's actually something that Gareth Evans outlined originally in that criteria, which was never taken up and hasn't been addressed subsequently. Second issue is the interest problem. So it's been framed as a responsibility, not a right. Yet in situations where there's great loss of life, there just continues not to be sufficient intervention, where there's no strategic or political interest or advantage, then this this doctrine is just simply not, it's not invoked, it's not even relevant, so it's not really legitimate if it's only invoked in situations where it's politically significant. Second issue, the third issue is it's being carried out in a decentralised, not centralised manner. So I've already gone through that code. I think this is a pretty interesting point, is intervention in this way actually helping? Libya at the moment has sort of descended into rival militias, and there's no stable governments. Is intervention in this way actually protecting human rights in the long term? And also arming rebel forces. It's such a political thing, and what's to say that force is not going to turn around and establish a government that is going to abuse human rights? So my thesis is basically that measures need to be taken to separate political intervention from humanitarian intervention in order to legitimise this doctrine, if it's to be a doctrine that is going to be sustainable in international law. And I've just sort of, in my initial research, pointed to a few things that need to be amended. And I think the first thing is looking at the uncertainties, inconsistencies, and looking at some criteria when the veto can and cannot be used, and in the situations where intervention occurs. The scope of the intervention, which I didn't get into much, but it's quite important, and the arming of rebel forces. And lastly, my hypothesis sort of thing is that if this doesn't happen, I hypothesize that that the principle will be undermined and it won't be legitimised, and strategic interventions under the guise of humanitarian interventions won't be tolerated by developing nations, especially emerging developing nations. Thank you.